Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mary Borrowman. I am a senior economist at the International Center for Research on Women and the technical lead for WeProsper, a global coalition for women's economic empowerment that now has over 60 members, including international and local civil society organizations, academic and research institutions, and private sector entities. Our coalition engages in strategic evidence-based advocacy to advance gender equality, address structural barriers, and foster women and girls' voice and power as economic actors. I want to start today by thanking one of our valued coalition members, APCO Worldwide, for hosting us in their new and beautiful space here in New York City. Thank you, APCO. This is truly an exciting moment for our coalition that just launched at the last Commission on the Status of Women, as we hold our first ever hybrid event here during the UN General Assembly, with the opportunity to be in person with such an incredible lineup of speakers today. Thank you also to the hundreds of people who are joining us online from all over the world. So today we're going to be hearing from our partner APCO. We're going to have keynote remarks from the government of Mexico before turning to a panel discussion. But before hearing from our esteemed speakers, I want to frame today's event by first turning to a short video that will feature the voices and perspectives of our coalition members and the communities that they serve.
Care work is the backbone of societies and economies. Globally, women and girls perform a disproportionate amount of unpaid household care work. Without affordable and quality options, care for the elderly, individuals with disabilities, and children falls primarily to women and girls who provide this work unpaid. This often results in negative impacts for their economic participation, independence, time, and well-being. And yet, policies and financing for care have not been prioritized globally, and care work remains undervalued. Across low and middle income countries, paid care work is largely informal, with low wages and poor working conditions. The COVID-19 pandemic dramatically compounded gender disparities in paid and unpaid care work even further, impacting women's labor force participation and obstructing women's economic empowerment, justice, and rights.
Due to gender discrimination and social norms, women around the world typically spend more time on unpaid care work than men. With this gender gap in unpaid care work, women and girls are less likely to attend schools, develop skills, and participate in the labor market.
We want to ask ourselves, are the childcare facilities, are they affordable to women? Are they accessible to women? And are they of good quality? And that our women who are carrying out their businesses, they can afford this.
Dianggap pekerjaan ini tidak memerlukan keahlian khusus ataupun pendidikan tertentu.
Poor medical care and access to health facilities, health information, and also since they are earning low wages, they don't have insurance.
又冇勞工保障啦，冇病假啦，好多社會嘅福利都冇，又冇產假啦。醫療啊，都嗰個病假都冇。
The time for action is now. WeProsper's evidence-based recommendations make a clear case for policy change. It is a critical time to invest in holistic and transformative policies for care, including quality and affordable services and infrastructure, which support rights and decent work for care workers.
Care constitutes one of the most important factors that can enable women's work participation rates.
Bahwa PRT adalah manusia, PRT adalah perempuan, dan PRT adalah ibu-ibu dari anak-anak mereka di kampung. Mereka sanggup meninggalkan keluarga tercinta termasuk anak.
Investments in the care economy are critical to supporting human rights, well-being, and women's economic empowerment. Through these investments and shifts in policy, together we can strategically advance economies worldwide and address structural issues preventing progress for women and girls.
There is a very important need to redistribute the burden of care work between the state and the households. The state should take responsibilities of providing proper care infrastructure.
This calls for a change now in the mindset, legislation, and practices to share care work equally and to build a more gender-equal economy.
WeProsper calls on policymakers, governments, and donors to prioritize investments in quality and affordable care services and infrastructure, whilst also supporting inclusive COVID-19 recoveries, sustainable economies, and women's economic empowerment, justice, and rights.
Yeah, let's clap. It was a great. And thanks to our communications firm, Skating Panda, for their help with that video. Crises are moments for us to reevaluate and interrogate our priorities, our values, and ultimately what we want to achieve. We are faced with multiple crises that have reversed decades of hard-fought gains in gender equality and threaten to exacerbate gender inequalities even further without action. COVID compounded gender disparities in paid and unpaid care work, and climate change is impacting many aspects of unpaid care work, such as water and fuel collection. And yet COVID has also created an opportunity for us by putting care on the agenda in global and national policy dialogues. This is an opportunity for us to envision what creating holistic and transformative policies for care could look like for our families, for our societies, and for our economies. It is also a chance for us to revisit critical questions regarding what we count as work in our national statistics, how we measure economic progress and conceptualize development, and what it could mean to create systems and structures that are truly inclusive and sustainable. There have been exciting policies, commitments, and initiatives that have come as a result of this opportunity, several of which we will hear about today. And particularly the Global Alliance for Care is a momentous multi-stakeholder achievement that we celebrate and support in galvanizing progress on care. Our coalition also acknowledges that to achieve the 5 R's that you saw at the end of the video, recognizing, reducing, and redistributing unpaid care work, and rewarding and representing paid care work, and to create transformative policies means going further than the current policy and funding commitments to address care work holistically. With that initial framing, I now want to turn to introduce our first speaker. Margery Kraus is the founder and executive chair of APCO Worldwide, a global advisory and advocacy communications consultancy headquartered in Washington, D.C., and the world's largest women-owned communications firm. Yes! Ms. Kraus has deep expertise in providing strategic counsel on issue-based communication, crisis management, market entry, and corporate reputation across diverse industry groups. Ms. Kraus's achievements have been recognized over the years through a number of prestigious awards, including the PR Week U.S. Power List, among many others. Margery, over to you.
I got nervous because if you're going to start reading all of those, I was going to interrupt because, you know,
there's so many.
No, but also that's not how we should spend our time. So I wanted to, first of all, I want to welcome everybody, and we're so glad to have this dialogue, and I'll get into this in a minute. But I did want to just diverge from the topic at hand because it really is part of the reason we do all of this. And I wanted to introduce Sagar Salafi, who's sitting here. If you could stand and just show everybody your face, your beautiful face. So Sagar happens to be Afghani, and she was a member of the girls' robotics team that went all over the world and was a target of one of the first targets of the Taliban. And they came after Sagar and her family. And thanks to Marta and to others, Judith and others, we were able to get Sagar and her family out and through Mexico, but now she's living in Seattle. And it was interesting because we were just talking about some of the things that not only women around the world, but especially Afghan women, even before, had to put up with as they try to even have a career and deal with care, which was a whole new thing. And you can imagine what it's like now. But it's just a reminder that even though we have a long way to go, we have to bring along a lot of other people with us. And so, Sagar, thank you for joining us. I hope you'll feel empowered to participate in the dialogue, because I'm sure your perspective will add a lot. So glad to have you here. This week has been interesting in New York, and there have been a lot of panels. I was participating in a couple. One of them was at the World Economic Forum, where they announced that we've now gone from 100 years to 130 years when we'll have equity between men and women. We've gone back 30 years. So we don't have a lot to celebrate at the moment. And we talked about the care economy and what an important role it plays in making sure that these opportunities for women and the equality of women can be had. Because when you have a situation where there's such disparity already between men and women, and then women take on the burdens that we've seen here and that we've heard about, it just doesn't help at all. And so I hope that we can come up with some very good prescriptive ways to look forward. I just thought in my few minutes that I had, I would tell you why APCO is so interested in this. It's partly being the founder. It's one of the privileges you get. But APCO was founded 38 years ago. When we founded APCO, I was raising 3 kids, and trying to build a business, and not having access to capital, and dealing with all the many things that the women in this room deal with. And so in a large part, I identify the story of women coming forward today as really my story. And that's why we put the books out, which catalog a little bit about this journey. And one of the things that I did in the book that you saw out there called Roots and Wings is that I wanted to write a book that talked about what we all bring from home to work. What is the value? It's 10 things that I learned from being a mother that I brought to help build this company, person by person, from 1 to now we're at over 1,000 people. And I thought it was important because it speaks to the value of and the values of what we bring to work. And I think that's the other side of this is not only don't we get paid for what we do at home, it's devalued in society. For years, we didn't talk about it. You hid the fact that you had this other life. And I wanted to empower everybody to stand proudly and say, these are things that we bring that give us greater value in the workplace, because we have this understanding of things you inherently learn being a mother, being a wife, being a grandmother, being a home care person. And so I think that was a very important thing. And I think APCO has a responsibility, given that we are majority women-owned and that we are now of maybe a force of some kind, we're large enough, that we could use our platform for good. And this is certainly an area that I think is ubiquitous around the world. We're at all different stages of this journey, but none of us escape the journey, because fairly or unfairly, the burden falls on women to take care of not only their children, but the last 3 years of my father's life, he lived with us. And so, you get squeezed between taking care of kids and taking care of other family members. And that speaks to the fact that during the pandemic, 3 million women left the workforce, 3 million women. So in addition to this backsliding on equity, and 3 million women left the workforce. And so I think we have to have solutions that work to not only bring these women back, but to deal with providing the support that one way or the other that helps these women. And I'll just say one other thing. One of the sessions I was in had Justin Trudeau. We were in a roundtable, and he announced that Canada evidently has just put something in place, or will be, that it will cost $10. Childcare will be like something like $10 a week so that women, it'll be subsidized because it has to be affordable. It doesn't make any sense if we have childcare or we have care that it costs more than women make in the workplace. You know, so there has to be, and I don't know if that was exactly the number, but it was the idea that somehow we have to have a good solution to this that helps recognize, not only recognize the value of care, but provides subsidies for care so that we can all have decent jobs, make decent income, and not take 130 years to do it. So, so that's why I'm here. And if we get into this a little bit, I can tell you some of the things that we've put in place to try to help on this as a company. But anyway, I don't want to take time away from my good friend over here. I think this is a very important session, and I appreciate everyone being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I will go ahead and give an introduction. But thank you so much, Margery, for those remarks really about your personal story and also really highlighting the importance of services being accessible and affordable. That's a very common theme in our recommendations for policymakers, is that important piece. But I now want to turn to introducing our keynote speaker. Martha Delgado Peralta is the Vice Minister of Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Government of Mexico. She is a public servant nationally and internationally renowned, with over 30 years of experience through the public federal administration and NGOs devoted to the protection of human rights. In her position as Vice Minister, she has been an advocate of Mexico's feminist foreign policy, increasing the number of women in leadership and decision-making roles around the country. Her work has been crucial in the launching and implementation of the Spotlight Initiative in Mexico, which fights gender-based discrimination and violence. She's outspokenly committed to achieving social and political equality on all platforms. Vice Minister, I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, Margery, thank you for gathering us. Always you are heading the best causes for humanity. I always see you leading the best causes for humanity. So I love you very much, but I respect you and admire you because of that. And I am also very happy of meeting Sagar here again after the refugee in Mexico. That was a year ago, almost a year ago, and we remember that very day, and we will remember your arrival to Mexico forever. So today is a special day because we are meeting you again here in the United States. When it comes to defend feminist foreign policy, a lot of things came to your mind. What is this, or for what purpose a government like Mexico is pursuing such a goal as a feminist foreign policy? And it is related also to not just for internal equity for women at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, having more ambassadors, making the foreign service more equitable for women. But we started analyzing that the inequity for women in the foreign service was exactly at the reproductive age, or when women started the family. In that very point, all the system established for these foreign service women is not taking into account that women are responsible for raising the kids or having this burden of different members of the family, maybe the mother, the father, or different responsibilities at home. So we analyzed the situation, and we understood that these careers are stopped because they do not have the time for studying, for growing, for going out abroad and to other countries, because they have to be stuck at home or doing other things that are not really preparing themselves for the exams or growing up in the diplomatic career. But that happens at the professional level, but also in every single level of the working life of the women. In Mexico, for example, adolescent girls between 12 and 19 years, we spend an average of double time, 20 hours per week, doing domestic labor. In the comparison with men, which is 10 hours. It's a double burden of work. And when it comes of salaries, of course, you know that for the same work are not the same salary. So Mexico is very aware of this problematic scenario, and we have managed to organize a national care system, among other actions, to generate the studies in collaboration with international organizations that are supporting us to construct the system in this area economically feasible, administratively viable, and also powerful for women. The objectives of this national care system are, first of all, to be universal for all the women, recognizing the care work as a human right, and also providing public services and generate economic growth for women in the country. And because of that initiative that it is heading by the Institute for Women in Mexico, also at the international arena, we have committed our activism at the Generation Equality Forum. We hosted that forum with France last year, and we created one of the coalitions that were established back then was a Global Alliance of Care. This is a global initiative of multi-stakeholder, which was launched by Mexico and the UN Women in the context of that forum. And now we have more than 50 stakeholders, part of the alliance that is led by the National Institute of Women in Mexico, and 13 national governments, including Canada, 2 local governments, 18 civil society organizations, 10 philanthropic institutions, and 6 private sector institutions, and also 10 different multilateral organizations. So these agencies, everybody, they are working in order to understand, but also to put in place different public policies in different countries, because it changes, you know, the situation of women in different countries. Mexico, through this alliance, will promote, of course, the appreciation and the recognition of care work as a human right. And we also endorse these 5 R's of care work, which are redistribution, reduction, recognition, remuneration, and representation. Representation is one R, which is very important in diplomacy, but also in other areas of the public life. So last but not least, I want to share with you that Mexico and Argentina, within the framework of the United Nations Human Rights Council, we promoted a joint declaration called to the states to promote action for this recognition, revaluation, and redistribution, as well as recognize the economic value that the activities that the women we do, which contribute to the national economies. And we have to size the level of the effort of women in the economies which is not remunerated, in order to understand the value of a presence of our work in society. So once I have said that, I think that we had to discuss what are our needs. I think that when we talk about these matters, it sounds like, okay, you don't like to work or what? No, we are very hard workers. We have a lot of energy. We just need this work to be organized, remunerated, and recognized. And if it is in the side of a public policy, I think that we are going to pursue this as a human right, as we are doing at in Geneva at the Human Rights Council. And as my boss, who launched 3 years ago the feminist foreign policy of Mexico, said back then, there is not a future in the world if 50% of the population is not equal to the other. So these 50% are women right now, and this is one of the most important characteristic of this inequality, the recognition of non-paid labor work. And the discussion is open to you, and thank you for inviting us to present the case of Mexico.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those really inspiring comments and for really digging into what the 5 Rs mean, why those are important, and also really raising this issue of why universal care systems are important and why it is so critical to really ground them in human rights. And I also want to take a minute to commend Mexico's leadership in the Generation Equality Forum and with the Global Alliance for Care. As I said, we are really enthusiastically supporting that and feel that there is a real great promise in the community practice that's building. I now want to go ahead and invite my panelists to come up and take a seat, but thank you again to our first 2 speakers for their really insightful comments. Anywhere is fine, yeah. While they're getting settled, I want to give a bit of framing for our panel discussion today. Addressing care holistically is not without its challenges, as the policy areas that this spans are vast and they're often siloed. They encompass our health and education systems, labor rights and social protections, service sectors, and infrastructure. And indeed, even when we speak about care infrastructure, this encompasses care-related components of traditional infrastructure, such as water and energy, and also components of social infrastructure, such as care services, that are critical to supporting the functioning of our societies and our economies. This challenges us to work together across silos and integrate care considerations in our economic and development policies. As our coalition has begun to synthesize data and evidence on aspects of care, with our report on childcare and long-term care in low and middle-income countries just released for UNGA, we have found that there are significant provision gaps with negative impacts for well-being, women's economic empowerment, and economic growth and development. For those of you that are here in person, there is a QR code for that report in your program. And for those of you online, we will go ahead and drop a link in the chat for you to check that out. And so taking seriously the practical financing considerations is a critical piece of supporting the care agenda, as financing is low and needed in many contexts, which will require strategic thinking, policy change, and coordinated action. However, there's also strong evidence regarding the positive impacts that can result from care investments in terms of employment, particularly for women, but also broader economic benefits. We can support many goals, including an inclusive COVID recovery, by investing in care. So we've convened today's event to continue to bring both specificity into the discussion on care with some of these financing and programmatic considerations, and to push us to make the most of this opportunity when care is on the global agenda for the most transformative policies possible by supporting a holistic dialogue with our panelists today. So we have 4 panelists today. Jamille Bigio serves as the Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment in the Office of the Administrator at USAID. Prior to joining USAID, Ms. Bigio served as a Senior Fellow on Women and Foreign Policy at the Council of Foreign Relations, the Director for Human Rights and Gender on the White House National Security Council, and is the National Security Council Representative on the White House Council on Women and Girls. Raquel Lagunas is the Director of Gender at UNDP, based in New York, with more than 25 years of experience working on gender equality in different development settings. She has spearheaded a number of impactful global initiatives, such as the COVID-19 Global Gender Response Tracker, which analyzes close to 5,000 COVID-19 measures from 226 countries and territories. Raquel has also advised governments across the world and large development organizations, such as the World Food Program, Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and as well as non-governmental organizations. Carmen Hernandez Ruiz is a senior policy associate at JPAL Global, where she manages the Gender and Economic Agency Initiative, synthesizes research findings in policy publications, cultivates research partnerships, and supports evidence-informed policymaking. Prior to joining JPAL, Carmen worked as a social protection consultant for the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. Catherine Niembura is a senior policy expert consultant currently leading ICRW's engagement in the Generation Equality Forum. Catherine has worked on women's rights, sexual and reproductive health and rights, adolescent health, HIV/AIDS, and gender-based violence for the past 12 years, including with FemNet, a Pan-African women's rights network. Her work, born out of student activism, transitioned into community organizing and currently involves working across the intricate linkages between grassroots organizing, national, regional, and global advocacy. So my first question is going to go to you, Jamille, and it's in two parts. So the US has increasingly recognized the importance of addressing care work globally, and specifically has conceptualized investments in care as key components of infrastructure, as in the Biden administration's commitment to the G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure and the World Bank's Invest in Childcare initiative. So my question for you is, how do you see care infrastructure being built out at USAID? Not just for childcare, but also for long-term care and aspects of domestic work, such as water and fuel collection. And part two is, what are the obstacles and challenges you see in addressing issues of care work and integrating this across programming?
Well, thank you so much. Such a pleasure to be with this panel and to be with you all on such a critical conversation. And as we've heard at the top, what the call to action is here, that investing in care infrastructure with a holistic lens means both increasing women's economic empowerment, it means improving child development, improving support for families and communities broadly, and it means economic returns. It means creating almost 300 million jobs by 2035 in the care economy, which translates to economic returns. It means keeping more kids in school, including adolescent girls who are doing care responsibilities in their families. So the implications are enormous, and that is driving USAID's investments across sectors. So there is the new childcare initiative, Invest in Childcare initiative that the World Bank has launched. USAID announced up to $50 million over 5 years and joined other bilateral governments and foundations investing in that with a commitment to saying, how do we both improve access to childcare services, but also improve the governance, regulations, laws around the care economy in those countries. So we invite other donors to join us in continuing to expand that initiative. But the other thing I'd note around childcare before I speak about the other parts of the agenda is that we are also investing more bilaterally as USAID in childcare work. It's important that we're investing through shared initiatives multilaterally like the World Bank, but it's also important that our own system recognizes investing in the care economy as an economic imperative. And so what we are doing at country level and saying, okay, as we are investing in advancing, supporting women's economic empowerment at country level, as we are investing in child development, et cetera, at country level, that we see the care component as a core lens, a core component of that work. So that's an area that we are also launching through new bilateral investments in early childhood care and education, and that includes in helping to finance women-owned social enterprises that are providing early childhood care. So thinking again about this link when we take the child care aspect, that it's both providing child care services for women to enable them to work, but it's also often women running the businesses or working in the child care centers. So just to note that component. We are also thinking, as we think about long-term care, a key component of long-term care is the health sector. So really seeing the health sector as an important part of the care economy. The US government, the White House, launched our new Global Health Worker Initiative. This is going to be a catalytic investment in expanding more diverse and gender equitable health worker pipeline. And that includes really focusing on professionalizing community health workforce. So that's the front lines as you think about how are families getting the support, the access to health care that they need, and the support that that provides for elder care, for longer term care. Then again, expanding that access, but supporting the more than 70% of women that make up the global health workforce, including those on the front lines as the community health workers. Domestic work, you brought up domestic work. This is another area where the US government has launched a global water strategy, for example, that is very focused on expanding access to clean water and recognizing that doing so, we need to also be investing in the governance of these institutions and strengthening the capacity of water utilities and looking at kind of where's women's participation both in the communities where they're going to benefit the most since they're the ones collecting the water, but at the decision-making table in water infrastructure and in government. So we've got an initiative called Engendering Industries that's working to bring more women into utility companies and engendering those utility companies. So that's another area that I'd highlight. And then finally, domestic work is another component that we are focused on. We know that this represents I think close to 20% of women's labor around the world is in the domestic work sector. And so as we're thinking about how do we care for the care workers around the world and strengthening the protections for them, ensuring decent work for domestic workers, labor, social protections, that legal recognition of domestic workers and the labor laws covering them is such a critical step. So in the US government, we've launched the Gender Equity and Equality Action Fund. And this is investing in the childcare work at the World Bank that I noted earlier, but also this domestic work, the caring for our care workers is another component of that initiative. So we are trying to take this holistic lens, and it's helpful to have conversations like this to connect those dots, because those are all in different sectors. They're different parts of our governments, of our institutions that are involved in them, but connecting that and saying, what does it mean to look holistically across this care economy and see these different pieces? How do they reinforce one another and support one another?
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to hear about the holistic lens and all the things that are happening. And I think particularly, this piece about care workers as well ties so much to what was discussed on the video and some of, I think, the most kind of moving parts of that, right? Of how to provide social protections and recognize that work. Raquel, I'm going to turn to you next. So the 2022 to 2025 UNDP Gender Equality Strategy includes a priority on gender-responsive social protection and care services to contribute to gender equal and sustainable economies. Can you please speak about your vision for how care will support these inclusive and sustainable economies and UNDP's role in supporting that work?
Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you for inviting UNDP. So when we started thinking in this new gender equality strategy, we asked ourselves, so why the progress on gender equality is so slow, so scattered, why we are still here, and how UNDP can contribute, right? So to the first question, there are many factors, right? But one that we found substantive is the economies, how they shape the power relationships in societies. So what we thought is the dimension of care is one of the triggers, one of the accelerators of change. If we can mobilize our we work in 170 countries, so if we can mobilize through our programs this different level of work that goes beyond benefiting women with training, that is fully needed. So I'm not diminishing at all this work, but if we can combine this with influencing government, so that's why it's so special that Mexico is here, because you are a champion. So if we can influence in this level the conversations and go through structural changes, this will be something that we will be proud of putting one little grain. So our new gender equality strategy, what is proposing is move a little bit from these mechanistic approaches to the work on gender equality towards going through more deep, kind of touching the deep roots of inequality. And care, I mean, you explained very well, and the video, why care is one of the roots of the disparities, and how women are very, very slowly approaching the labor market, or losing opportunities to become leaders, or a long chain of consequences. So for us, we think we don't need to fix women, we need to fix the system. And it's something that we are not newcomers working on that. In 2021, we worked in 73 countries, helping with this expansion of social protection that I fully agree with the government of Mexico. It needs to be universal. So we work in 73 countries, and we are in this new strategy prioritizing. The first dimension is the producing data. It means that we need to keep going and make this more visible even. So we have the UNDP UN Women COVID-19 Global Tracker, that it was during these last 3 years giving lights, for instance, over these thousands of measures to respond to the COVID pandemic, only 6% included this dimension of care, only 6%, and only 12% targeted the big gap in the labor market, or the economic insecurity of women. So when we have these numbers, then we can go stronger for the global advocacy and regional and in the different levels. So data for us is very important. We also work in innovation, of course, how we cannot bring digital in the creation of this infrastructure on care. And there is a lot of innovation coming, again, from Latin America. It's not that I am from Spain, but I am very attached to Latin America, because professionally I grew up there and as a feminist. So in Latin America, we are piloting a georeferential system to track and monitor and help governments to identify their gaps and go through the decision, kind of policy-making decision. So, and the third one, of course, is help governments to go through the entire cycle of planning, costing, and implementing the expansion of care infrastructure and care systems. So we have good examples in different countries, helping at the community level, because maybe I think we need always to give the space to recognize the role of women, the safety networks that they create, right, at the community level. So we need to give the visibility, the recognition, all the 5 R's. So for UNDP, this is one of the key priorities. Absolutely, yes. I mean, I can keep going, but let me see if I am forgetting something. But I think I will stop here.
Perfect. I love so much what you said. This idea of care as an accelerator, right? I think that's really, really well said and well framed, and also not fixing women, fixing the system, right? I think this resonates with me so strongly as someone with a background in feminist economics, right? We need to think about the systems and structures and the way that those are impacting things, and how are we really getting to the root of structural barriers. And it's also really core to the framing of our coalition as well. So I really appreciate those remarks. Carmen, let me now turn to you. Through the Gender and Economic Agency Initiative, JPAL funds evaluations of strategies to promote women's work and enhance women's economic agency, including what works in terms of programs. What can you share with us in terms of evidence regarding the relationship between care investments and sustainable and inclusive economies? And what research gaps do we still need to fill?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having us, and let me bring JPAL's and the research perspective to the conversation. And yes, it's lovely to hear you too and be part of this. And so, as you mentioned, GIA seeks to build a strong body of evidence around how to enhance women's economic empowerment. And as we know from the video, women do bear the burden of the most of household and care responsibilities, comprising childcare, but also elderly care and cares of people with disabilities, so long-term care. And yes, I guess just as a quick reference, in 2018, we knew that over 600 million women were outside of the working force, the labor force, because of care responsibilities, and this compares only to 40 million for men, so it's a huge difference. And so far, the evidence we have coming from affiliates and the Gender and Economic Agency Initiative is that childcare has the potential and can help women enter and remain in the workforce, and this can support us in achieving sustainable economies because it also includes like true women economic empowerment, income, but also children's development, as were previously mentioned. And yes, I think I can give 4 examples of studies of providing free or subsidized care. We have evidence from Brazil, Kenya, Indonesia, and Chile, so coming across regions, where we have found that it increased women's labor force participation. And I think also we have discussed that we know maybe like our experience as women, like how childcare and care broadly prevents women from participating, but having this rigorous evidence informing policy, it's of huge value, and also seeing how the positive effects of the evaluations come from women who were not working before, suggests that the lack of childcare actually was the factor that prevented pursuing labor for opportunities. And the example of Chile is how providing aftercare services to children aged from 6 to 13 years old not only increase women's labor force participation, employment, but also household income. And another result from this evaluation is that women are likely needing also childcare for older children. So an unintended, well, not an unexpected result was that there was also an increased demand for daycare services for the smaller children that weren't part of this program. And lastly, while this program didn't target children's outcome, they also found like children were attending more to the school, and for example. And just thinking about the future research and where we see gaps is, I think the new evidence needs to focus on understanding what types of models work. We have more evidence around center-based services, and depending on the context, we would need to have different types of provision models, and also learning what is more cost-effective, and also if providing additional inputs can support, make a difference. And on this, we have seen, we have recent evidence from one of the JPAL's affiliates in Uganda, where they were providing either subsidies or cash grants or a combination of both to mothers, and there was a huge impact from providing childcare. It led to at least as large as impact as the cash grants. And also there was an improvement in child's development. So we see a strong potential of reducing poverty and promoting inclusive economies. So that's why also one of the GIA's or initiative efforts is to fund research around flexible work policies, and working on policies that enable environment for care services, like learning how women can balance better their responsibilities and work, also leveraging digital mediums. And yes, and as you well mentioned, we also need to build more evidence around long-term care. Many regions, like as Latin America, are aging very rapidly, so we need to start learning about that too.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I think this research is so important and compelling as we drive policy, right? We need to get into some specifics about what is working and what the evidence is for what the outcomes are, and also identifying these research gaps helps us all move together as a community and build this evidence base further. So thank you. Catherine, the Generation Equality Forum features investments in care and decent work for care workers as central to achieving economic justice and rights for women and girls. How does unpaid care work manifest in the African region, and how do you see global policy processes such as the Generation Equality Forum that you work on supporting policy change and more care investments in the region?
Thank you so much. So I think listening to all of the 3 speakers who spoke before me, to me, unpaid care work provides a platform for what intersectional feminist analysis looks like. Coming from Africa, for example, we understand that if we did not have women and girls, the frontline of the global HIV response, it would have been much more worse. The concept of home-based care, for example, is fully powered by women's labor. If you look at, if you think of demedicalizing family planning and ensuring that people access family planning tools, you often think of a community health health worker, and that's a woman in most cases, right? And if you think of that, to me, is more or less like subsidizing the state. When public services are not functional, it's women who have to step in to provide that subsidy to the state. And I think oftentimes when resources come, we don't see that matched up as well. For example, within the HIV discourse, we don't see women's groups getting as much resources commensurate with the work that they put in. And I could go on and on. With the Ebola crisis, for example, the last the last folks who were left with the disease were women. Why? Because they were the care workers, right? And there wasn't enough research to showcase sexual transmission, for example, with Ebola. And with women who had to leave the labor market as well to go and provide care when these things happen. So I think in Africa, really, for me, it's not just manifestation, but really an intersection of both the energy, poverty, and broken public health systems, and lack of investment in public infrastructure. And African feminists and feminists across the world have really made this case for a long time. And I think the way I see it is platforms like Generational Equality Forum that were happening at a time when the world needed care. You know, the world everywhere needed care. We all were at home, you know, confronting folks, the spread of a contagious pandemic, and we did see how this was manifested. And having the leadership of governments like South Africa within the economic justice and rights, constantly highlighting the cost of this and how women and girls were being affected, in addition to gender-based violence. I remember the most iconic quote for me during the pandemic was, during gender-based violence, the frontline responders are women's rights organizations. Because when people couldn't move around, it's a shelter next door that victims and survivors could go to, which are often run by women and girls, or they're often run by community systems. So I think it's important for us to maintain that analysis intersectionally. It's important for us to keep ensuring that at the end of which we center the individual, but also we center different realities, because it's one thing for us to represent research in sterile. It's, you know, as I'm a researcher myself, but I feel like constantly ensuring you center the individual and keep the person at the center is important, and especially investing in that way and looking at the leadership of Generational Equality Forum. I feel like that was helpful in terms of building momentum, because for a long time I think feminists had been talking about the triple burden, the double burden, and we weren't gaining as much traction. And so in a pandemic, that was really helpful to see. And now with the Global Alliance for Care, we have governments like Tanzania who've joined. So making sure we keep the leadership of Mexico and others as Generational Equality Forum commitments are being implemented, and the commitments of the financing keep flowing, because we know the next step is financing. If we don't finance the care infrastructure, then we still see the gaps continuing. So what it means to me is really Generational Equality Forum and other processes provides a platform for showing what intersectionality looks like at the policy level, but going a step further to demonstrate what programming and investment looks like. And at the same time, I think for my region as well, from an African perspective, showcasing what generational equality looks like at a national level implementation, at a regional level implementation, because I think part of why South Africa was very successful is at the time they were the chair of the African Union, right? So they were able to galvanize many African governments to listen. So ensuring we leverage that level of leadership and then we take that back into national realities is really key, and continuing that is really the vanguard of the next stage of Generational Equality Forum.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I think this reflection on the importance of these platforms, especially in critical times, but how we move forward, right? Continuing to work together and build momentum, especially as you said around this financing piece, but also in ways that are context specific, right, to needs of different regions and are really based on individual well-being, right? It gets back to what you were saying earlier in grounding in human rights and this kind of universal access. Raquel, I'm going to turn to you now. We can see that your gender equality strategy envisions a concept of care that goes beyond the traditional form, what kind of way we think about care, towards a more holistic approach. For instance, you aim to address time poverty through energy investments. Can you develop this further for us? And considering that climate change increases unpaid care time, how might we begin to think about creating programs which incorporate care considerations in these types of infrastructure programs?
Thank you so much. I want to share with all of you two numbers. Clean cooking cabs save more than 1 billion hours of women collecting fuel wood over a year. And this represents a workforce of 80 million people. Wow. This is just, we need to keep repeating the numbers. When rural electrification was introduced in South Africa, the time women spent on housework decreased, leading to a 9% of increase in the labor force. So there is a big point in UNDP that we have a big portfolio on energy to link the unpaid care work to energy and to infrastructure. So it is in our gender equality strategy. It is strategic for us. And we are at the beginning of this work. We are not at the beginning of the work on the climate change kind of portfolio. But what we see as a main entry point for us is we work with governments to accompany them in the national NDCs and the NDCs, National Determined Contribution Plans. So right now, not everything is kind of negative. There are like 96% of the NDCs, with the ones that we work, have introduced some gender mention of the gender dimensions, right, of the climate crisis. So we think that this is the nut that we wanted to crack. This is the entry point for us that is always more for UNDP, the dialogue with governments at the national level and supporting them to continue making progress in giving visibility to the connections between poverty reduction, climate change, energy, and care, right? So this is how we plan to do it. We are creating, not us, not the gender team, UNDP is creating a global energy hub, and we have already the first expert full-time to work with this team. So we will continue during the next 4 years bringing these connections, because I mean there is a huge potential in the green transition, right? And we cannot ignore the context. I was very touched by your point of the financing. How are we going to finance this transition? Well, there is a lot of money going to the climate change, to the green transition. We are in the middle of a huge crisis. So that's where our goals are, to somehow follow the money, follow the financing. We are, at the same time, we will see coming this crisis, the debt crisis. So we cannot be naive and think governments will approve a huge plans to build infrastructure for care. No, it may not happen, but if at least we can go, and for UNDP this is what we are prioritizing, I didn't mention before, a tax reform, fiscal policy reform. It's another way of impacting in a level that is so fundamental. We can have the best models, right, coming from our great colleagues from JPAL. We can understand what works, but if we cannot finance what it works, and we have a government in the middle of a crisis that cannot feed the system, the public wealth system, we are in problems. So our priority area linked to energy is kind of impact on this portfolio, but also in the fiscal policy reform big program that we have present also in 80 countries. So that's the way that we are going to hopefully make great progress without being naive.
I love that framing. And I think that's often kind of one of the things when we're talking about financing, right? I think there's a sense of, yes, there are fiscal constraints, right? Countries are going to be facing very difficult circumstances with debt overhangs and these other pieces. And there's this other thing, right? There are ways in which we can reform existing systems around tax policy, around fiscal policy to create more space, to prioritize existing resources in a better way. So thank you for helping us as well understand the connections between climate and care and start thinking about those pieces. Carmen, I'm going to turn to you next. As we think about a holistic agenda for care, social norms are a key component that can be a challenge to think about in crafting policy. We often see this social norm piece kind of thrown on into things, but it's hard for us to think about kind of the tangible pieces. Could you share with us key features that the evidence shows can be effective to shift restrictive gender norms on unpaid and paid care work, including valuing care work?
Yes, for sure. Yes, I guess that we have discussed one of the first pieces is how to reduce the burden of care. but then we need to think how to evenly distribute it, and I think that's where gender norms come in. And yes, I can share some lessons that we did a lit review over 100 pieces of evidence around the world. And well, the first key lesson that we should keep in mind always is that gender norms indeed moderate or even block the impacts of programs that are trying to increase women's empowerment, regardless or not they were trying to take into account the gender dynamics in their design. And while this is not surprising, it's a good contribution to have empirical evidence confirming this. And yes, we have examples on women businesses in different settings. If they were living in households with other businesses, typically owned by men, we weren't seeing impacts, so they benefited less and decided, likely due to gender norms, to allocate these additional funds to the man-led business. So this is just an example of saying that access to resources doesn't equal control over them. So a broad lesson there is that the programs that were more likely to be successful if they employ design features with mechanisms that gave women more control over their resources. And yes, and I think this relates a bit on the climate change piece. If women are already doing most of the household chores, that advances in production and infrastructure will likely free up women's time, but we would expect for them to be able to actually live a change. But the good news on this evidence piece is that we've seen that gender norms can change over time, and we have seen a change in attitudes. For example, on mass media campaigns, being useful and helpful in change attitudes toward gender-based violence in Uganda. And one of the main examples we have seen is how classroom discussions over gender have improved gender attitudes among adolescents in India. So this it's an example of the Breakthrough program in India, where adolescents interacted in classroom discussions on gender equality over 2.5 years. And we saw not only changes in attitudes, but in particularly for boys, they reported doing more household chores. That is what we would want to see. So now we are trying actively. One of our research priority areas is to generate more evidence on restrictive gender norms. So having either family counseling or gender dialogues targeted to adults, and thinking about changing patterns of domestic work for women and men. And one of these examples is that we are funding also the long-term impact evaluation of this same program in India, so to see how these changes in attitudes in adolescents would look like 5 years after, if they're like continued impact. Yes.
Thank you. And very hopeful remarks around some like really practical things that we can start thinking about, right, as we create programs and the ways to integrate this into existing programs. So thank you so much for sharing that research. Jamille, with many actors in the global space speaking to the importance of care work, what do you see as the role for civil society and coalitions in supporting more holistic commitments and policies for care globally?
Well, I think today's conversation and this platform emphasizes how critical that role is. There's so many silos, both within the investments in the different aspects of the care economy, and even with the civil society and businesses and others that are involved in each of these different sectors. And so, it's important that we are connecting those dots, but having civil society do that will support the governments to model that. So seeing civil society build the coalitions across the different sectors, across the different elements of the care economy, as you're doing with WeProsper, is so critical to help connect that and then bring that to the governments and others kind of doing those investments. The other piece, as we've heard, is that civil society is on the front lines of providing many of these care services. And so, both hearing from them, what are the priorities, where are the opportunities to support them, as we do have this momentum now and more attention to how critical the care economy is to the other goals we want to see in society. And then the other piece is the innovation that civil society organizations are identifying as they kind of are doing that work and are seeing where are the gaps and what are the solutions as they come together. We did an assessment, for example, a mapping looking at different childcare solutions and found some really interesting and effective programming that included parent-teacher associations partnering with communities to provide care services for informal workers, for women working in the informal economy, and these ways in which these networks, again, civil society leaders were connecting and creating a model that was successful that we can then look at, okay, how can we support and scale up that solution? And so it's that innovation at the front lines that civil society organizations are leading that is critical as we now look to invest more in this holistic approach.
Amazing, and I think inspiring in terms of the work that many in this room are trying to do together to take this forward. So thank you for those reflections. And Catherine, the work of feminist advocates and activists has been instrumental in supporting the development of an unpaid care policy in Kenya. Could you please share with us what strategies have been effective for getting policymakers to develop this policy? And what opportunities exist to expand this work beyond traditional partners and stakeholders?
Thank you. This will be a very long-winded answer, but just bear with me for a second. So at the time when we had the SDGs adopted, I think all governments, and particularly Kenya, was invested in making sure that the SDGs were a success because they played a big role as part of the open working group and all of that. And just going back to think about implementation, there was a whole data process and mapping where we had data through the tier system, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and I won't bore you with those details. But in terms of thinking about Goal 5 and implementing Goal 5, especially Target 5.4 on unpaid care work, then there had to be an introspective discussion as to what does it mean to measure unpaid care work? What is unpaid care work, right? At a national level, the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics is the best ally, is the biggest champion for this particular agenda in the country. And so what that meant is as the indicator process of figuring out what indicators we have and what is not in existence, that was the opportunity for women's rights organizations and activists and advocates to kind of have a discussion as to what is that, how that manifests in Kenya, and make sure that, and through the Make Every Woman, Every Girl Count program by UN Women, where Kenya is one of the flagship countries, then that was the entry point for just figuring out how to make sure that at a national level there is that robust discussion as to, one, the gap on gender data on unpaid care work. And so that was the entry point for making sure that over time, I think between, should be 7 years now since adopting of SDGs, for the first time, I think last year we had the first time use survey that was implemented. That was the first opening, the door opened, and feminists just rushed in and stayed in the room and opened up the space. So we've seen a robust conversation at the national level with government on unpaid care work. It's a policy conversation and kind of flagged by the gender data conversation. And that has been very exciting. And the time use survey, time use data was kind of a great way for us for the country to see and for a practical conversation on the cost of women spending time on unpaid care work, what that means for them not participating in labor markets, and what that means in terms of them missing on leadership. And the entry point for that was time use survey, mostly for informal women. And that was led by Oxfam, of course, in partnership with other organizations. So I think that was an effective strategy, very exciting. Again, for the first time when we had the census, we had gender data specific questions within as part of that. So the gender data conversation has really been an expansive platform for folks who've been working traditionally on various topics on gender to make sure that the government pushes the envelope a little bit more on unpaid care work. So the National Bureau of Statistics is now the biggest champion for unpaid care work conversations at the country. And pivoting back to traditional mechanisms like the technical working groups and the gender sector working group, there is now a beginning of a discussion on having an unpaid care policy at the national level, very nascent stages of development, but nevertheless, it's progressing. So I think it's a mix of opportunity of the SDGs and making sure that Kenya has volunteered to do 2 voluntary national reports. And at one time, while they were giving the report, SDG 5 was being reported on and making sure that there was something to say, which meant something had to be done, right? And I think being strategic in that way and making sure that folks leverage existing infrastructure to collaborate was one. And then the policy is another one. And just in terms of moving forward, the opportunities for me are Kenya has promised, as part of the Gender Equality Forum, the 12 of them, one of them is ratifying the ILO C190, which is a platform for ensuring that care workers GBV is addressed in workplaces, including for care workers as well. And so just looking at how the implementation of that or the ratification process will ignite a robust discussion between activists, private sector, and the government is a platform for us to sustain this discussion. At the same time, one of the other commitments is on engaging women's rights organizations and making sure that the existing platforms for that engagement continue. So I kind of feel like the movement and the momentum will continue because it's already been ignited, but there's platform and space for that to continue. And we're just coming from an election, so and hopefully this new government will continue prioritizing women's economic empowerment, within which unpaid care work is a really critical conversation and discourse in there. So I think at the national level that exists, and at the regional level there's many governments like Malawi Malawi, South Africa, and others who are part of different gender equality action coalitions, but also there is the regional mechanisms through Maputo Protocol, regional instruments like those ones in the African Union to just ensure that there is momentum at the country level, at the regional level, and that cascades to the global level.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And I think there's a lot to take there, but from Jamille and your remarks around the ways in which governments and civil society can work together, right? But I love that you brought up this point about gender data and time use in particular and how effective this is. I want to shout out our partners, Data2X, who are here, who really do incredible work leading the charge on gender data globally. In the ways in which we need better data, right, to inform policies, and this type of data can be incredibly compelling because it helps us make the case to move forward. So I do want to go ahead and with the end of our panel, give you all a chance to ask a couple of questions. So we've had a very packed time today. We will only have time for a couple, but I would love to hear from audience members what they would like to hear from our esteemed panelists. Yes, Delhi.
Hi, Delhi Severn of Data2X. Thanks so much for the comments on gender data. We also know...
Sorry, I think they want you to use the mic, if that's possible. Yeah, thanks.
It's heavy.
Thank you. I was saying Dilly Severn of Data2X. Thank you so much for the recognition of the importance of gender data. We also know that because of the pandemic that most national statistical offices also saw contractions in their budgets. So a question for the panel about how can we get maybe creative around resourcing and supporting national statistical offices, especially when we think about time use surveys and more, and the necessity of them in times of crisis, with technical assistance and more. How do we wrap our heads around that? Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe we'll take one other question and then we'll let panelists respond. Yeah? Let's get that mic to you.
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you. So thank you. This was super helpful and informative. But I wanted to ask, particularly with this next COP coming up, as we're thinking about the intersection of climate and care, what can we do to be ensuring that we're mainstreaming these conversations and it's not just people working on gender issues and gender topics talking about this?
Great questions. Does anyone else have one before we go back to our panelists? Yeah?
I actually have two, so I don't know, but if that counts. So, hi, I'm Pooja. I work for a grassroots media company in the rural north of India. On the 5 Rs, I wanted to hear more about redistribute and reward. We know that redistribute links with gender norms, and we did touch upon that. And reward beyond, of course, economic empowerment, yes, please. But what else also does reward mean? That's one question. The other one I wanted to ask was, since we know these are intersectional issues and we have touched upon it, what are some of the stumbling blocks that you all feel coming from sort of different areas of looking at the same problem? Like, what are the things that kind of keep getting repeated and we don't move ahead and we all sort of keep working in our different silos, as someone mentioned? Yeah, thank you.
Great question.
And thank you for the panel. It's really awesome.
Yeah, who wants to go ahead and jump in first? Answer any of the above.
Start on climate. You want to start?
I was going to start with the climate.
Yeah. Go for it, and then I'll go.
So on the climate, I think there are two things very important. That is, and I didn't mention that, and it's also part of our priorities. That is work with institutions, with ministries, with the ministries of environment. It's so fundamental. So when we go to the COPs, to the day that is the financing, focus on the financing, you have in the middle of the agenda also how to finance the gender equality dimension of climate change. So I think it's fundamental to do this kind of ants work long term, but invest deeply in the internal change of ministries of environment, ministries of energy. But this is a long-term solution. It's not a short-term. So in the short term, I think the advocacy is fundamental. So through the mechanisms already working on gender equality, the CCC, and the main kind of the ones that represent the gender equality agenda. So we need to use them more. We need to coordinate with them. We need to support them more so they can negotiate hard in the overall agenda of the COPs. How to do a proper, I'm not going to say mainstreaming, integration, or give more visibility and go to the agenda of the other days, not only the gender day. Yeah. So now we are working, for instance, with Egypt government. So we are proposing the discussion on financing. Let's do it the day of financing, not the gender day, but it's not easy. So over to you. You wanted to?
Yeah. Add on this, so one of the things USAID Administrator Smith Powers said is that climate change is sexist, but our response shouldn't be. And this is kind of recognizing we know that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate disasters, by natural disasters, higher mortality rates, et cetera. We also know that the undue burdens, the burdens around having to walk farther to collect water, et cetera, that impacts women and girls disproportionately. And so, what does it mean then for our responses to not be sexist? The first piece is to respond to the data, back to the importance of data, knowing this and having that inform our policies. It means, as we talk about, mobilizing climate finance, of doing work to ensure that it's more gender responsive, that those resources are reaching women's organizations, women climate leaders, driving climate action in their communities, and that is a core component of our response to the crisis and our solutions, our climate action. The other piece is to have those investments also be addressing the ways in which women are disproportionately affected. So having that all as a component. And then the other piece that we're investing in is supporting governments with their own climate action plans, of supporting them to make those gender responsive. So again, back to integration here of that the vision and the policies that countries are laying out, their visions on a just transition. What does it mean to shift into green economies? How are women part of that? How are women benefiting from those new jobs and increasing their employment in green industries where they're already underrepresented? So that we need targeted attention now to help bring them into the green industries where we're trying to drive more jobs, for example. But have that be explicitly part of national governments' climate action plans as well as another way to be focusing. And that includes too coming back down to the access to water and the on-the-ground experiences of communities that are getting hardest hit. That national government policies, the data is tracking it, the donors are responding to supporting solutions that are explicitly addressing the disproportionate effects on women and girls.
Catherine, Carmen?
I think to your question about stumbling blocks, the care conversation I think was the most difficult when it started in the country because, as I said, eventually the National Bureau of Statistics was the ally, but the initial discussions about how dismissive they were And I think the minister alluded to it. You don't want to work, we should pay you to give birth. You know, those kinds of it's kind of a very, for feminists, it can be a very difficult discussion to have with policymakers. And before you build that trust, before you build that understanding of what that is as a policy issue, it was a bit hard. And at the same time also, I think because we have different strategies to doing things, to advocacy, right? Some of us, some feminists will want a much more radical analysis. Some people will want a much more pragmatic approach. Some people will find some framings instrumentalist. So finding what works between the movement, because what I've seen, the care discussion as a policy one has been the one that has brought traditional feminist organizations, data organizations, and human rights defenders, for example. So can you imagine what that looks like in a meeting? It's a bit hard, because that means that you have to I don't want to be the facilitator of that meeting, but you can imagine what that looks like. It took a while to kind of frame it, but I think eventually it took off. And that meant that everybody who, wore a different hat, the researchers were going hard in terms of breaking down very simple concept. And it kind of reminded me the work of doing, the need to do the work all the time, because we assume that we've done the work. It's 26 years after Beijing. You don't need to explain this, but unfortunately you do, right, sometimes. And so I think for me, it's keeping that humility as we do this work, that sometimes you have to win people over with simple arguments. And it's not everybody who understands what this means, Not everybody knows what GEF is, for example. So having the patience to do that is important. And I do feel, to your question about financing, I kind of feel like ensuring that when you build multi-sectoral movements, that when you're not in the room, you don't have to worry about your issue being left off the table. Because in many instances, we're not in the room with some of these actors, like national statistical offices. So making sure you have people who will keep your voice in the room is critical. And I do think that coming from and centering this within the recovery conversation, we've been effective in that, but making sure that we continuously build up the need for financing it is critical. Is how I'd respond. And I think to your other question about movements, it's really the point about financing those movements, right? We cannot projectize women's lives, which is what we try to do many times without success. But I do feel like making sure that we fund movements and not issues, because we know that it's movements who will drive this agenda, right? And it's movements who've been able to build the momentum. So if you don't projectize everything, it means you won't have to worry about that being left out, because then movements are continuing to go forward. And I think that comes back to financing people who do the groundwork all the time. And yeah.
Thank you. Carmen.
Yes, I would just add to this that whenever we think about research, also making sure we are at the table, making gender like a cross-cutting team across sectors, even if it's more work, making sure that our climate action initiative has a gender focus or gender considerations into account. So I think that's
cool. Do any of you want to weigh in on the R's piece, the reward and redistributing?
Well, one thing you said earlier that resonated is the idea of how women in their families and as care workers are subsidizing the state. And how do so when we're talking about the resourcing and the reward aspects of it and the redistribution as well, it's kind of looking at how do we name that with the data, and then shift what our value is there, and to actually value and invest and talk about what decent work is for care workers, valuing the work that women are doing in the home. And I think, there's lots of different conversations around that, obviously. One piece is to take the childcare as an example. Sometimes the way we talk about it in our advocacy around this or in the data is sometimes the childcare burden. And people are triggered by that and respond to that in some ways. And so I've heard some speak about it as an opportunity. And what does it mean for men to be able to engage in the opportunity of parenting and have deeper relationships with their children? And interesting there to see some of the incentive systems, countries that have parental leave policies where it's lose or use. The father takes that time or the family gets less time, and the way that tries to incentivize fathers to actually take that additional time but seeing that again as a benefit for the family and for the society, as opposed to the frame of, well, this is a burden that we all have to share, equally share. And so I think some is the language around that. Harder to make that spin to, walk the miles to collect water. So, I mean, it's kind of looking at where the different opportunities are around that. But I think, that's one space where there is a lot of really positive conversations happening about the benefits of childcare being one that's shared, and a deeper space for positive father engagement. And then the impacts that, when we're seeing that, the impacts that has on other norms and on other distribution of work as well. And that's what they've seen with some of this research, is that started with the parental leave, the paternal leave, but then that had ripple effects, because suddenly the fathers were in charge of things in the home for those months, and suddenly they were engaged in the system in a different way. And so that's, where, back to the research JPEL and others are doing, it's so helpful to see where these systems giving that nudge that helps to have kind of some of the broader ripple effects we want to see around social norms.
Mary, I just, I guess before we close, I just wanted to offer a couple of ideas of things that we're doing that maybe are easy to adopt elsewhere. So one of the things we did, because there was such a shortage of workers, that's how we came to this, but it really fits in with the whole care economy, is we created a program called APCO Encore. And we created a flexible, we went out and we sought women who wanted to come back to the workforce but couldn't do it full time. But they also didn't want to come back at a lower level than where they left, because these were professional women. But so we found that there are women who've been out 5, 6, 7, 8 years who just didn't know how to come back. And so I think any company that has any kind of jobs that don't require a certain schedule could implement this. It's very simple, and negotiate with the person coming in about what their schedules are and what their work is. And so people who still need to get back to care for kids coming out of school, or taking, their parents to doctors. It was a very easy thing to do, and it's been a tremendous success for the women coming in, and we're going to expand it globally. So that's just one idea. The other thing is, I just wanted to call your attention, and we could give you the link for this, but we also worked to create a Marshall Plan for moms that was done in partnership with another organization. And it's things that companies can do, so you can take this out and show people, to make their workforce easier for moms. And so there are just things like that maybe could be helpful. So, and just as a PS, my husband, I'm married 56 years. My husband, I couldn't have done this if my husband didn't help, and it was a very different era, but his relationship that he built with the children has lasted, a lifetime. And now as a grandfather, he still does it.
Thank you, Margery. And I hear our reception getting going, so I think we will go ahead and close out here. But I think we've had a really rich discussion today. There's a lot of common threads that have come out, I think, in terms of the importance of gender data, the really need to take seriously the financing piece, how civil society and governments and other agencies can work together. So a lot for us to think about and take forward. So thank you all for joining today, both in person and online. Thank you to our really incredible speakers. And thank you again to APCO Worldwide for your hosting us and your use of this space. For those of you who are with us in person, let's keep the conversation going and the reception to follow. But policymakers, leaders, and donors, we invite you to engage and partner with us to support a holistic and transformative agenda for care and on women's economic empowerment issues more broadly. We also invite local, regional, and global civil society organizations, academic institutions, advocacy organizations, and private sector organizations that are interested. Please join us to really take this agenda forward. And lastly, we encourage you all to spread the word about WeProsper and the work that we are doing. So thank you all so much, and I look forward to engaging with you in this section. Yes, please. Let's get a photo. Let's get our